Oh man, let me tell you about my marriage. My wife, Karen, and I have been together for almost 18 years now. Can you believe it? Our anniversary is coming up really soon, on December 8th. I wouldn't change a thing about our life together. Sure, we've had our share of fights, but the making up was always worth it. That's just how we are. There was one rough patch early on, in our second year together, but other than that, it's been smooth sailing. We tied the knot when I was 20 and Karen was just 18. We had known each other since we were kids living right around the corner from each other. My older brother Lars had married Karen's sister Ingrid a year earlier, so it felt like the natural next step for us. The challenge came when Lars and Ingrid had a baby within their first year of marriage, but we weren't so lucky. We went through a bunch of tests, even though the doctors advised us not to stress and let things happen naturally. But Karen's mom kept pushing us to start a family. She was always like that, especially since she had only daughters besides Ingrid. My mother-in-law, Sarah, was eager for a grandson after having all girls herself. The test results were inconclusive. Karen was fine, but I had a slightly low sperm count or something like that. Honestly, I never fully understood all the details. The doctors reassured us that the situation wasn't too serious and that everything was all right. They advised us to be patient and assured us that our first baby would come when the Henreich was right. Although we tried to be patient, the pressure did put some strain on our marriage. Luckily, we didn't have to wait too long. In our third year of marriage, Karen gave birth, just as the doctor had predict Peter. Emily arrived, a beautiful baby girl. It eased our worries about whether we could have children. From then on, everything settled down, and our marriage became even stronger. We were more relaxed about it all. Soon after, Karen became pregnant again, and finally, Carl was born.
Asson.
The whole family was ecstatic. This doesn't mean we loved our daughters any less, but having a son felt extra special for us. I was the first in our family to have a son, and I proudly told my big brother about it. He just smiled and told me to give him Henreich. Well, he got his chance, and sure enough, the following year, they had their first son too. 8 months later, we welcomed another son, Gustav. It was like buses. You wait for ages, and then several come at once. With 2 brothers and 2 sisters, we lived like one big happy family. Even when Karen's other sisters got married, they became part of our close-knit family too. It was wonderful for the children, and we always had someone to watch them when we needed. From what I could tell, the other couples were just as happy as Karen and me, enjoying the simple joys of married life surrounded by loving family. We faced a few challenges, like when Lars had his work accident. I felt like I was right there with him as they transfused my blood into him. He recovered, and I was fine too. We often joked in a brotherly way that we were now truly blood brothers. As our 20th anniversary approached, we wondered how to celebrate it. Lars and Ingrid had celebrated their anniversary the year before, and we all had such a great Henreich that we decided to do something similar. We booked a private room at the local hotel for a big gathering of family and friends. Then there was Emily, our beautiful 17-year-old daughter. She looked like a younger, perhaps even prettier version of her mother. With shiny dark brown hair and big green eyes, she always caught your attention. She had a similar slim figure, with nice legs and other features that maybe a father shouldn't think about too much. Naturally, she had a string of boyfriends, and the house always seemed to have one of them around. But she was level-headed, so we just rolled with it. Carl, I always thought, took after me. He was solidly built, and it swayed Peter him. He loved rugby, just like Lars and I did at his age. At almost 16, he was already a regular player at fly half for his school's first team. Then there was young Gustav, the youngest. Maybe he was going through a rough patch. He wasn't as good at sports as Carl or as popular as Emily. Poor Gustav wasn't having the best Henreich. Nothing serious, though. He was very smart, probably even smarter than the other 2, and did really well in school. He just AC Peter like a typical, totally incomprehensible teenager that day. Maybe I should have been more understanding. Maybe I should have overlooked the mess he'd left on the dining table. Maybe I should have just cleaned it up for him. But did I? No. You're not going out until you've cleaned up that mess, Gustav. I told him firmly. I'll do it later, he replied, sulking. You'll do it now, Gustav, I said, my patience wearing thin. Why are you always singling me out? He showed Peter back, losing his cool. I'm not. I replied sharply. You're part of this family, and you'll follow our rules like everyone else. Who's going to force me? Gustav nearly cried, really losing his temper. I will, I readier Peter, starting to lose my patience. I'm your father, and you'll do as I say. My father, huh? He yelled back. You sure about that? I froze in shock. My next words stuck in my throat, stunned by what he said. Sorry, Dad. Gustav quickly interjected. Peter, his face pained. Sorry, Dad. I didn't mean to say that. I'll clean it up right away. With that, he looked away from me and quickly tidied up the table, gathering the books and other items he had left there. Within minutes, everything was cleared, and he hurried out of the room without saying another word, leaving me lost in my thoughts, wondering if my world was about to crumble. The problem, of course, was that Gustav had always been so different from the other two. More studious, more serious, but less outgoing than his older siblings. I often wondered why he was so different and had even discussed it with Karen, but she just shrugged and told me I was imagining things. Was I? Had I been? What made Gustav say that? If he had just yelled it in anger and walked away, I would have been upset, but that would have been it. But he was so quick to apologize and take back his words. Why? What did he know that I didn't? Oh no, I didn't want to entertain the thoughts racing through my troubled mind at that moment. My initial impulse was to go find Karen and demand answers. But what good would that do? What would I say? I couldn't just accuse her of cheating on me. If she had, she'd deny it, and if she hadn't, how would she ever forgive me for doubting her? Besides, it had been 16 years or more ago. But did that even matter? Was it still happening? My escarlac churned and I felt nauseous, and I still didn't know if I had reason to worry. Oh God, what a terrible day it was. Blood types. That's it, I thought. Without hesitation, I went to our study and found the kids' medical records. Emily, Carl, and Gustav were all O positive, which, from donating blood to my brother, I knew was the same as mine. I felt a sense of relief until it dawned on me that blood types didn't tell the whole story. If Gustav had a different type, that would be one thing. But them all having the same group could just be a coincidence and didn't confirm that he was truly my son. Oh dear, what should I do? DNA. I couldn't believe I was considering such an extreme measure over one angry comment from my son. I was overreacting. But when Gustav avoided eye contact during dinner that evening and left the table without a word, my concern grew. What's wrong with Gustav? Karen asked, noticing his odd behavior too.
No clue, irraplia, shooking.
Do you guys know? They shook their heads, seemingly oblivious. Has he been upset about anything? I prodded, but they shook their heads again. Once the kids left the table, I mustered the courage to ask my wife. Gustav seems so different from the other two, Karen, I began. Any thoughts on why? Let's not dwell on that, Eric, she replied, getting up to clear the dishes. He's just a bit deeper than the others. End of story. Was she avoiding the topic deliberately, or was she genuinely unconcerned? I couldn't tell. Why not consider DNA testing? 20 minutes later, I was researching it online. An hour later, my head was swimming with information, but I wasn't much closer to an answer. It wasn't until Monday morning that I finally found a lab that could do the test. It took me nearly an hour, and my secretary could have probably done it much quicker, but how do you explain to your secretary why you need a lab test exactly? That's why I did it myself. The lab could do it, no problem, but it was expensive, especially if I want Peter the results back quickly. But I had to know before I risked ruining my marriage. When I explained I needed to know before risking my marriage, they suggs Peter I send samples from all three kids to cross-check along with one of my own. Ever tried getting a hair from your grown-up kids? Not easy, I'll tell you. And with Gustav avoiding me whenever possible, it was the hardest of all. But I managed it, sent them off, and why Peter? Now all I could do was wait to find out if Gustav was really my son. Over the next week, Gustav seemed to calm down, probably relieved I hadn't brought up his outburst. We almost reached a point where I felt I could gently talk to him about it, but I thought it best to wait for the results now that I had gone down this path. My wife, of course, continued to be her usual loving self, and nothing else changed in our daily routine. It may not have been the most passionate lovemaking we had during those days, but I didn't turn her down. Doubts were gnawing at me inside, And even though I tried my best to hide it from Karen, I couldn't engage in inhericacy with her without wondering. If someone else had been involved over our 20 years of marriage, I had to know. One evening, we had dinner with my brother and his wife, and when he and I had a moment alone, I almost confessed my worries to him. We were so alike in almost every aspect, so if someone else had fathered Gustav, it logically couldn't have been him. Why was I even entertaining such thoughts? Was I already so paranoid? Something held me back. I didn't need to burden him with my uncertainties, and deep down, I believed he would support me if the results turned out unfavorable. I remained composed. I stayed silent. I kept so quiet that Karen asked me a couple of Hinrichs if everything was all right. I reassured her, saying I had a few things on my mind. She looked concerned briefly, but didn't push further. When the results arrived, I had them sent to my office just in case Karen got there before me and opened the letter. With trembling hands, I read it, trying to grasp its meaning. Would this piece of paper mark the end of my marriage? After reading it, it seemed that Gustav's results matched mine, and I felt a sense of relief even though I didn't fully understand it. Medical terms are like gibberish to me. The report was filled with terms like good match and close match, so it appeared that my worries were unfounded. What a relief. Tears welled up in my eyes as I thanked my lucky stars that I hadn't shared my fears with Karen. I decided to make it up to her that evening, perhaps by taking her out to dinner. Upon rereading the covering letter, which I hadn't paid much attention to before, I noticed that the lab wanted Peter me to call them to discuss the results. I figured they just want Peter to squeeze some extra cash out of me and wasn't sure if it was worth the hassle. When the phone was answered, I introduced myself as Eric Jones and mentioned that Dr. Hoskins had asked me to call. After providing some references, I finally got through to the doctor. "Hello, Mr. Jones," he greeted me. "Have you had a chance to review the results we sent you?" "Yes," I replied confidently. It seems that my worries about my son Gustav were unfounded. "Yes, indeed," he responded. "But it's not quite that simple, I'm afraid," he added, and my heart sank as I waited for him to deliver the bad news. "You mean he's not my son?" I stammered. "It's not that, Mr. Jones," he clarified. "There's less than a 1 in a million chance that he's not your biological child. I am certain that he is your natural-born son." "So Gustav is my real son?" I sighed in relief. "Yes, he is, Mr. Jones." "Then what's the problem?" I asked, feeling uncertain. What else could be wrong? I was starting to worry because I had heard that DNA testing could also reveal genetic diseases. "It's the other 2 samples you sent in," the doctor said heavily. "What about the samples from your son's brother and sister?" I asked, feeling a surge of panic. "Is there something wrong with one of them?" "Well, it seems that they are only half-siblings to your youngest son, Mr. Jones," the doctor explained. "Half-siblings?" I stuttered in shock. "What does that mean, doctor? What's a half-sibling?" "It means, Mr. Jones," he continued, "that it's highly unlikely that you are their biological father." The phone slipped from my grip, and the next thing I knew, I was surrounded by my concerned coworkers as I struggled to regain consciousness. "Give him some air," someone called out as I slowly came to, gasping for breath. "Are you okay, Eric?" another voice asked, and I nodded weakly, attempting to stand. They helped me back into my chair, chatting among themselves about the workload and the office temperature. It all seemed so trivial compared to the bombshell I had just received. Thankfully, someone arranged for me to be driven home and urged me to take the rest of the day off. I was grateful to find the house empty upon my arrival, with Karen at work and the kids at school. I knew what I had to do next, even though I dreaded it. With trembling fingers, I dialed the laboratory's number again and soon found myself speaking with the doctor once more. I apologized for the abrupt ending of our previous conversation. "No worries, Mr. Jones," he reassured me. "Our postal service can be tricky to navigate at Hinrichs." I assured him that I understood, and he patiently reviewed the test results with me once more. "Gustav is definitely your son," he confirmed, "but Emily and Carl are unlikely to be your biological children." "But the results showed good or close matches," I pleaded. "Could there be a mistake?" "If we had only one sample, we might request another for verification," he explained. "But with 2 samples, the likelihood is nearly certain. While Emily and Carl are full siblings, It's improbable that you're their father. But you said the matches were close, I insist, Peter, clinging to a glimmer of hope. What does that mean? Do you have a twin or a brother, Mr. Jones? The doctor cautiously inquired. Or perhaps another relative? My brother, I exclaimed, a surge of excitement coursing through me. What does my brother have to do with this situation? You'll have to come to your own conclusions, Mr. Jones, the doctor's voice droned on. But I wasn't really listening anymore. My world had suddenly shattered into pieces. What should I do now? In my marriage? Sever my lifelong bond with my brother? You can't choose your family, after all. Should I just pretend I didn't know anything? Keep living a lie? I couldn't bear it. And what about Gustav? He knew something was wrong, but had the wrong idea. From now on, I'd see my son in a different way, but I couldn't love Emily and Carl any less. They were my kids, no matter whose genes they carried, and no piece of paper could change that. But what about Karen? That was the real question. What about her and my jerk of a brother? And Ingrid, my sister-in-law? How would they react to the news? How would the rest of the family handle it? So many questions were swirling in my head. Oh God, this was all so complicated, Peter, and I didn't feel ready to deal with it. I vaguely remember stepping out of the front door and starting to walk down the street. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in the hospital with bandages all over my arms. I had stumbled in front of a car while completely distracted, Peter, but I didn't remember any of that at the Henrike. Eric, are you all right? I turned to see who had asked, but it hurt. It hurt like crazy. Then I recognized the voice and realized it was my wife speaking to me. Not really, not yet anyway, I replied. She was still my wife, and I didn't say much more. I couldn't find the right words. What was I supposed to say? Hey honey, just found out 2 of our kids aren't mine, and you've been messing around with my brother. How was your day? What's for dinner? Yeah, that didn't sound quite right, did it? Anyway, it turned out my injuries weren't too serious, and they sent me home the next day. I couldn't do much for myself, so I relied on Karen to take care of me. It gave me Henrike to think, Henrike to plan, but honestly, it felt like a waste of Henrike because I still didn't know what to do. The main concern now was Gustav and the other 2 kids. Whatever decision I made had to be in their best interest, even if it meant sacrificing my own. Karen's needs came last from then on. All I knew was our 20th anniversary was coming up, and the room was booked for our big dinner. I had to figure things out by then. Within about a week, I was more or less back to normal, at least physically. Everything seemed to fall back into place while I contemplated my next move. But Gustav was different. He seemed like he was on the edge, just the right age to act out. You should talk to him, Eric, Karen said one evening. I don't know what's bothering him. He doesn't seem to want to talk to me anymore. I knew she was right. Gustav was struggling, and I needed to be there for him. I just wasn't sure how to start the conversation. I'll have a chat with him, I promised. Any idea what's going on with him? She asked me. I've got a few ideas, I said shortly. Want to talk about them, Eric? She asked. Not really, I replied, catching her off guard. The chance came the next day when I found him alone in his room, and he couldn't avoid me. Want to talk about what's bothering you, son? I began gently. He just shook his head, not wanting to open up. Is it about the other day, Gustav? About our relationship? I pressed, noticing a maturity in him that surprised me. You don't understand, Dad, he challenged me. I might know more than you think, son, I countered, trying to keep a smile on my face. Then why don't you do something about it, Dad? He pushed back. Why do you let them get away with it? Wait, this wasn't going the way I expect, Peter. It seemed like we were talking about something else entirely. Get away with what, son? I asked, confused. You really don't know, Dad, he repeated, Peter. Apparently not, son, I admit, Peter. It's Mom and Uncle Henrik, Dad, he whispered. When you're at work once a month or so, it's so embarrassing.
Onkel Henrik.
Darn it, I muttered under my breath. Henrik wasn't Karen's husband. He was married to another one of Karen's sisters. Oh, I mumbled pathetically, unable to think of anything else to say. They've been doing it for years, Dad. My son informed me solemnly. Emily thinks I'm Henrik's son, not yours. With that, he broke down in tears, and I wrapped my arms around him to comfort him. It had been a long Henrike since I'd done that, and I was surprised by how big and strong my little boy felt. I can guarantee you, Gustav, I assured him as I continued to hold him, you are my son in every way, not Henrik's. How do you know, Dad? He sobbed. How can you be sure? I'm sure, son. I told him confidently. Believe me, I'm sure. We talked for a while longer, and without revealing too much, I managed to convince him of his true parentage. It was like a weight being lifted Peter off his shoulders. However, my brother's involvement as the father of Emily and Carl was not mentioned. Revealing that my supposedly perfect family was not as content as I had thought, both Emily and Carl were aware of their mother's affair with their uncle but opted Peter to ignore it, unsure of how to address the situation. It was a terrible position to put them in. As for Henrik, he was the youngest of the four sisters and undoubtedly the most attractive. While Karen had her charms, Henrik's wife added another layer of complexity to my already strained marriage. A few days later, I took all three kids out for lunch and did the most challenging thing I've ever had to do. I disclosed everything I had discovered. Throughout the day, I anxiously awaited Peter their reactions, fearing the worst. Surprisingly, they handled the news relatively well. Emily shed a few tears, and Carl sat with his head in his hands, clearly distraught. Despite their initial shock, all three expressed a desire to confront their mother immediately. However, I convinced them to hold off as I needed to sort out a few things first. All three of them pledged their love and loyalty to me and were close to cutting ties with Karen for good. I managed to dissuade them from that, reminding them that despite her mistakes, she had always been a caring mother to them. I spoke about her in a way that didn't quite match my true feelings, especially after hearing the kids' revelations. According to them, Karen, my supposedly loving wife, had been involved in some kind of relationship with her brother-in-law Henrik for a while. However, it probably wasn't long enough for him to be Gustav's father. The once-a-month claim might have been an exaggeration too, but none of us were certain. One thing was clear, though. The kids felt relieved to finally share their burden, and all three of them shed tears. Yes, even Carl joined in as we gathered together that evening. Let me correct that last statement. All four of us shed tears. I craved revenge, but I had to find a way to seek it without causing pain to my children. And yes, I chose my words carefully. I meant it when I said I needed revenge. I meant it for him, and yes, I meant it for my children. I pondered for a while but couldn't come up with a grand scheme for revenge. It seemed like a direct confrontation was my only option. Luckily, I had the upcoming event to do just that. The 8th of December, our family had gathered as families do. With my parents gone, Lars and I were among the older ones that night. 39 of us sat down for the celebratory dinner, mainly Karen's side of the family, along with some of our mutual friends. They said the meal was good, but for me, it might as well have been cardboard and dishwater. Then came the speeches. Here we go, I thought. Was it the end? Or perhaps just the beginning? I was sweating buckets and trying to calm my nerves with deep breaths. What I had to do wouldn't be easy, but it had to be done. Welcome, everyone, I began, starting with some small talk. Then I steered the conversation towards celebrating 20 years of marriage with my wife, Karen. But there were some very interesting and personal things about our marriage that I needed to share with everyone. And that's where things were about to get interesting. Laughter filled the room, and there were a few jokes about our bed life. Karen blushed, thinking it was all in good fun. But little did they know how mistaken they were. As the laughter settled, Emily stood up abruptly, followed by Carl, and then Gustav, without a word to anyone. The whole table watched, bewildered and curious about what was going on. Come back here, all three of you, Karen exclaimed, jumping up. Don't be disrespectful to your father. Only Carl glanced back at his mother with a sad shake of his head before joining his siblings outside. David, Karen called to me, desperate for me to intervene. Do something. Tell them to come back right now. It's all right, dear, I responded firmly. They already know what I'm going to say, and since it concerns them, maybe it's best they're not here. Karen looked shocked at my response, first surprised by my defiance, then worried as she tried to understand my motives. Sit down, Karen, I commanded firmly, my tone leaving no room for argument. As I was saying, I continued, scanning the faces around me, I've had 20 years of what I thought was a perfect marriage until a few weeks ago. I paused for effect, feeling the tension in the air. Some looked puzzled. Others still wore smiles, expecting a joke. But many seemed concerned, surprising me. Imagine my shock. I went on when no one spoke up, to discover that Emily, my beloved daughter, is not biologically mine. Karen couldn't hold back her sobs, her hands covering her face, breaking the silence. Would you like to tell everyone who Emily's real father is, Karen? I asked, but she remained silent, only her crying disrupting the quiet. Fine, then, I pressed on. Does anyone else want to confess who's been with my wife behind my back? No one dared to speak, and I stood there, my gaze sharp and accusing, surveying the stunned faces of my family and friends. As terrible as it sounds, there was a strange satisfaction in exposing those who had deceived me. They had no idea how much I had uncovered. I couldn't resist giving my brother Lars a stern look, and he visibly squirmed under my gaze, knowing he had been caught. No one's going to confess? I challenged them. Do I have to reveal the truth then? To my surprise, Lars's wife Ingrid stood up abruptly. It's not what you think, Eric, she exclaimed, distressed. It wasn't an affair. We just had love a few Henriks to help Karen get pregnant. The whole family had been eager for a boy, especially my mother, and it seemed doubtful that I could father a child. If someone had dropped a feather at that moment, it would have knocked me over. Ingrid knew. She knew about her husband, my brother, fathering my daughter. Looking around the table, I saw a mixture of shock, confusion, and disbelief on the faces of my family and friends. The betrayal cut deeper than I had imagined, and the room felt suffocating with the weight of the revelations. My mind raced, and the anger I had suppressed for weeks began to boil over. So you all conspired against me? I spat out, my voice shaking with rage. You all decided that I didn't deserve to know the truth about my own children? Karen sobbed louder, but I couldn't muster any sympathy. My gaze landed on Lars, who avoided eye contact, his guilt evident. Lars, I said, my voice steadying as I addressed him directly, you've betrayed me in the worst possible way. How could you do this to your own brother? Lars finally looked up, his eyes filled with regret. Eric, I didn't want it to be like this. I never want Peter to hurt you. Well, you did. I read Peter sharply. And now, there's no going back. The room remained silent, the tension palpable. I turned to the rest of the family, my voice now calm but firm. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that I won't let this betrayal define me or my children. We deserve better. With that, I walked out of the room, leaving behind the stunned and guilty faces of those who had wronged me. Outside, my children were waiting, their expressions a mix of concern and relief. I took a deep breath, the cool night air helping to clear my mind. It was Henrik to start a new chapter, one where truth and integrity would guide us forward. I saw the room divided into two camps. Some were shocked, while others seemed unsurprised. Friends who were unaware and family members who mostly seemed to be in the loop. As I stood there trying to collect myself, friends began to excuse themselves one by one, leaving around 17 or 18 of us, all relatives. Why don't you go play over there? Suggs Peter Linnea, another of Karen's sisters. Gradually, the younger children were sent off. The teenagers were encouraged to leave too, but it seemed like they were glued to the scene, not willing to miss the drama. Well, you all seem to know what's going on, don't you? I exclaimed, looking around. You're all aware of this mess, except maybe the kids here. A couple of husbands appeared confused, but nobody denied it. Look, Eric, my brother attempted Peter to explain. It's not what you think, I swear. He seemed poised to say more, but my expression of pure anger silenced him instantly. So you all knew that Lars slept with my wife and fathered Emily, huh? I demanded of the table. Nobody admit Peter it outright, but again nobody denied it. I swear it was just 3 Henriks, Eric, Ingrid defended herself, her voice rising. Whose ridiculous idea was this, anyway? I show Peter angrily, my frustration growing. Once again, nobody dared to speak, but too many eyes shift Peter towards Sarah, my mother-in-law. I should have known, I muttered, acknowledging her role. Thanks a lot, Mom, I said to her with a heavy heart. Your desperation for a son has shattered my marriage. No, Karen finally intervened, her voice trembling. Please, Eric, don't say that. I can't imagine life without you. Can't you find it in your heart to forgive one mistake? One mistake? I echoed incredulously. Just one mistake? Yes, honey, Karen pleaded tearfully. It was only that one Henrich. It seems so foolish now, but back then Mom's plan made sense. And what about Carl? I pressed her, my tone firm. Well, he's yours, of course, Eric, she assured me. Wrong. I correct Peter her sternly. I've had a DNA test done, and his father is the same man as Emily's. The atmosphere in the room shifted Peter instantly. What are you saying, David? Ingrid exclaimed in shock. You heard me, Ingrid, I confirmed, not backing down. If my dear brother there is Emily's father, then he's also Carl's father. Silence hung heavily in the air as this revelation sunk in. You scoundrel! Ingrid snapped at her husband, her voice trembling with anger. You promised me this wouldn't happen, and then you went off and slept with that woman again. Lars muttered, avoiding eye contact, clearly regretting his actions. And you traitor! Ingrid yelled at Karen, her voice seething with anger. I agreed to let you have my husband, just that one Henrich, and then you continue sleeping with him. With that, she marched 3 steps towards her sister and slapped Karen hard across the face. You deceitful whore, she spat, striking Karen repeatedly until someone intervened and pulled her away. Tears streamed down Ingrid's face as she was restrained. Are you satisfied, Mom? I demanded, glaring at Sarah, but she remained expressionless. So who else has been betraying me? I challenged the room, locking eyes with Henrich, who sat across from me. You scoundrel! Linnea screamed beside me, shocking me with her outburst. It's true what they said. You did sleep with her that night at the party. Confusion filled the air as Linnea turned to her husband, Peter, who sheepishly admitted Peter to the accusation. And you, my dear sister, Linnea turned her fury towards Karen. Have you slept with all your brother-in-laws, you shameless woman? Well, she certainly had her way with Henrich over there. I interject Peter, feeling a mixture of vindication and despair as the family secrets spilled out. The room was in chaos, with accusations flying and emotions running high. Karen sobbed uncontrollably, unable to defend herself against the barrage of anger and betrayal. In the midst of the turmoil, I felt a strange sense of relief. The truth was out, and the weight of deception was no longer mine to bear alone. It was a painful, messy catharsis, but it was also a necessary one. As the arguments continued to rage, I quietly stepped outside, needing a moment to collect my thoughts and decide my next steps. The night air was cold and crisp, a stark contrast to the heated emotions inside. I took a deep breath, feeling the chill calm my racing heart. The road ahead was uncertain, but at least now, it was a road paved with the truth. The chaos in the room seemed to reach its peak as accusations flew and tempers flared. Henrich's feeble attempts to deny the accusations only fueled the chaos, leading to Linnea delivering a swift blow to his nose. Don't bother coming home tonight, she yelled at him. In fact, don't ever come back. Ingrid unleashed her fury on Lars. I'm divorcing you, she declared, her voice trembling with anger. And I never want to lay eyes on you again. The 3 upset sisters linked arms and headed for the door, hurling insults at Karen as they stormed out. Sarah remained stoic, staring straight ahead, while Alf, my father-in-law, spoke up with regret in his voice. I'm sorry, Eric, he began, his words heavy with remorse. If only I had known. But apologies seemed futile in the midst of such betrayal. When Lars approached me with hands outstretched, a look of profound shame on his face, I couldn't find it in me to forgive him. Nothing, you scoundrel. I readier Peter, swinging at him with little strength behind the blow. He stumbled backward, tripping over a chair and landing sprawled on the floor. That seemed to mark the end of the festivities as the atmosphere soured, draining the fun out of the evening. Karen didn't return home that night, and after grabbing a few things, she never returned. The kids were adamant about not speaking to her for a while, and despite my own feelings of hatred towards her, I had to prioritize their well-being. Eventually, they softened and allowed her back into their lives, but things were never the same. The family was torn apart, with two of the sisters who left that night filing for divorces, leaving only Ingrid to stick with Lars. However, she gave him a rough Henrik, believing in giving him a taste of his own medicine. About 3 weeks later, one of my other sisters, the attractive one, gave me a call and asked me out for dinner. We ended up sharing a deeper connection, reminiscent of the early days with Karen. As for my brother Henrik, his marriage faced its own challenges, with Ingrid indulging in affairs with Lars's friends, one by one. Jan's long-suffering husband, Alf, had had enough of her meddling and bought a 40-foot yacht, spending his days sailing around Europe. Meanwhile, Emily crossed paths with a young Spaniard while sailing and eventually tied the knot with him, benefiting from his family's ownership of one of Europe's largest boat marinas. As for my boys, they're taking their Henrik and not rushing into marriage too soon, perhaps learning from their father's experience. And as for me, I'm considering giving marriage another shot. But this Henrik, I'm looking inward. There's a mutual affection between us, but we're both a bit cautious. Henrik will tell if it's the right decision. I want to be certain that I'm not getting married partly out of spite toward Karen, although I must admit the thought of her reaction if I did tie the knot again brings a smile to my face.